Okay, people are coming. We'll give people another minute or two to arrive. How's everyone this morning? Doing okay. I was a little surprised to find the party in the next room. I was hoping they hadn't moved in here yet. They've got the stage set up, but apparently they don't come in here for a little while. Yeah, I think I'll wait until the singing is over. That actually raises an interesting question. Does Noah have an anthem? Okay, well, I guess we might as well get started. Anyone who wants to join us can join us. Today's topic is Linux security and a little bit about backups. This is an important subject, but not as much fun perhaps as some of our topics. I want to start today with a little bit about how the government does its security, and then kind of go into some generic security topics from there. As federal employees, we have guidelines that we're supposed to follow. Those are mostly put together by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which just coincidentally is part of the Department of Commerce. One of the things that they give us at NIST is the Federal Desktop Core Configuration, or FDCC. There is an FDCC profile for Linux. So if you want to use Linux on your desktop at the federal workplace, you're going to need to get it in compliance with the FDCC, which dictates services that need to be turned on and off, and ports that need to be opened and closed. In addition, if you're building a Linux system that's going to be something more than a desktop PC, you're going to have a certification and accreditation authority to operate in order to operate the system. Any computer system that we stand up as the federal government either needs to have a what they call CNA package or be part of a general purpose CNA package. Excuse me. But there are concerns above what's necessary to obtain a CNA. There's plenty of CNA'd systems that have been hacked or compromised over the years. One of the reminders that I like to give people is about physical security. If I can physically get to a box, I can kill it. I can destroy the hard drive, I can pour water on it, I can unplug it. So no system is secure unless it's physically secured. After you physically secure a box, you need to think about the logical security, keeping people from hacking into it, making sure that it's patched and that it doesn't crash. And then there's a third category that you might call personnel security, and this is often overlooked or neglected. We just order people to be secure, but you've got to engage people and get them to help in security, or security won't work. The overwhelming majority, according to the FBI, 75% of all destructive hacking incidents are done by disgruntled employees who had legitimate access to the system. So after you physically secure a system and after you get all the CNA package done, you've solved 25% of the problem. The other 75% is treat your employees well and get them engaged in the security process so that they cooperate with it. There's a number of documents that make up the security universe for federal employees. These are things that we are required to comply with as part of FISMA, the Federal Information Systems Management Act. NIST has some circulars about security. They have quite a few circulars about security. And what they are trying to do is paint security as a risk management exercise. So it's not just about whether your system gets hacked or not. It's keeping services that are important up and running against the risks that they face, some of which are hacking, some are loss of power, some are hurricanes. So whatever risks your system faces, you should have a plan for managing those risks, which includes security controls, password checking, those sorts of things, but includes other things like disaster recovery as well. So these are just some of the circulars that NIST has put out to guide us in our efforts. Some of these things are templates for plans that we have to have on file in order for a system to get a CNA, and some of them are just general guidelines on how to run systems like the FDCC profile for desktops. It's quite a voice. Okay, so here's a very simplified overview of the process for getting authority to operate a system in the federal government. This process used to be called certification and accreditation. They're now changing it because, you know, consultants have to have something to do. They're changing it to assessment and authorization. They're trying to get people to view this as more of a continual process rather than a once every 3 years exercise. There are places you can go to get a full week course on this process. So this is a very simplified overview, but basically you start with your system design documentation. If you've got a system that's already running and you're retrofitting it with a CNA, you would of course look at the actual system documentation above and beyond the system design. From there, you use a process outlined in the FIPS 199 document, and you do a security categorization. You look at how important the services the system provides are and how sensitive the data it's carrying is, and whichever is the most impact determines the level of your system. You have a high, medium, and low, or high, medium, low impact of that system being lost. Once you've categorized your system as a high, medium, or low using this FIPS 199 process, you then go to the NIST 853 document, which is a series of controls. Now these controls can be everything from documentation to password checking to locks on the doors. There's a lot of different controls in 853. You select the ones that are mandated for the level that you've categorized your system at. You can add controls. This is not meant to keep you from making additional controls available, but this is the minimum set you would need to implement for a system at that level. Once you've done that, you would develop a system security plan, which is just documentation on how you're going to implement those controls. When you write the SSP, you follow a template that's laid out by NIST. And then you would develop an assessment plan. You're going to have to test those controls. And NIST document 853A tells you how to test the controls that are specified in NIST 853. Sometimes the testing is interviewing an employee to see if they understand the procedures they're supposed to be following. Sometimes it's going and testing the password on a machine. There's different types of tests, but you have to document how you're going to test those controls. Then you have somebody perform the test, Historically, that's been done by consultants, but that process is getting very expensive, so NOAA internally now is starting to cross-pollinate. The person doing the testing of the controls shouldn't be anyone who was involved in writing the control plan or developing the system. There should be an independent tester. So what NOAA is starting to do to save money on consultants is they're taking security people from other line offices or other systems within the line office who don't normally work on a system and have them do the ST&E, system test and evaluation, instead of hiring somebody to do it to save money. In any case, you're going to have some residual risks that fall out of that. There's going to be controls that are not adequately implemented or controls that fail their testing, and those are going to be residual risks. You need to come up with a plan of action and milestones for those risks, a POAM. And it's just a little mini project plan. This is how you're going to fix it. The alternative to having a POAM is to ask your authorizing official to just accept it. There are some systems which just inherently can't implement all the controls. For instance, from large manufacturers like Sun or HP, you often run into a case where there's an operating system patch which, if you apply it, will break Oracle. Okay, so you're going to get a ding during your ST&E for not being up to the latest level of patches on your OS, but you can't implement the patch because it'll break Oracle. Okay, so you've got to go to your authorizing official and say, we want you to just accept that risk because we have to run that way. So you either come up with a plan for addressing the risk, or you ask the authorizing official to just accept that. Then you present the results of all of this to your authorizing official, and you ask them for the holy grail of the security process, which is an authority to operate. Once you have that, you're good to go. You're allowed to turn your system on and let people log on to it. There's such a thing as an interim authority to operate. Nobody likes those. Those are bad. But sometimes, because a system is inherently hard to secure, while you're getting your act together, you'll ask your authorizing official for an interim authority to operate, which says the system is so important, it's providing hurricane information during a storm. Okay, we have to keep it running, but it hasn't passed its CNA. We'll operate it under an interim authority to operate. But one way or another, you get your system covered by your authorizing official. Then on a regular basis, usually annually, you take some subset of those controls that you tested in your ST&E and test them again every year. You select a set of them for continuous monitoring, and every year you retest those controls. And then the cycle repeats itself. So that is the framework that we work in as federal employees for security. This is just an outline of the broad categories of controls that are involved in obtaining a CNA. You have security assessment and authorization, planning, program management, risk assessment, system services acquisition. Those are under management controls. Operational controls, you have awareness and training, configuration management, contingency planning, etc., etc. Technical controls, you have access control, audit and accountability, identification and authentication, system and communications protection. So there's quite a broad variety of controls. Now, under each of those categories, you might have anywhere from 1 to a dozen individual controls that you have to implement. So here's a couple of examples of controls. AT1, security awareness and training. Basically, your organization has to develop and disseminate, at some frequency you get to define, a formal awareness policy for security. So you have to train people in security procedures. If you work for NOAA and you use a PC, you're required to take an annual security awareness course. You've probably all had to do that. It's not terribly odious. AC7 is a control for unsuccessful login attempts. Basically, it says if somebody keeps trying to log in and they keep getting the password wrong, you lock them out. So those are the kinds of controls that you need to document and then test in order to get an authority to operate. when you are documenting these controls, look for people who have done this successfully already. You don't always have to reinvent the wheel. As they say, nothing succeeds like success. There's also categories of controls that may be what are called common controls within your organization. For instance, NOAA has an authoritative directory, an LDAP directory, that we use to log into our email and some of our websites. You can use that as a common control for authenticating people to your system if it's a moderate system. So you don't always have to build the control yourself. You can refer to controls that have been built already. However, just doing all of the NIST controls won't necessarily secure your system. Sometimes you need to improve on those security controls. This is something of a political cartoon here, but security tends to drive by looking in the rearview mirror. What this cartoon is referring to is, in the security realm, we're always talking about 9/11. That's what everyone is obsessed with. However, we're spending $1 trillion a year making the rubble bounce over in Afghanistan, and we're not noticing that the Chinese are about to eat us for lunch. That's meant to be a joke. So, when it comes to physical security, you may have locks on the doors, you may have badges to get in, but sometimes you need to think a little bit beyond that, because there are ways of circumventing the controls that we normally rely on. So let's say that somebody can physically get into the room with your system. And you say, well, that's okay, because even if they got to my system physically, I've got a password on my BIOS. They couldn't reboot the machine. Well, what if they can get inside the chassis and take the battery off the motherboard? Most systems, that will erase the password from the BIOS. So they may just be able to get in there. So you've got your hard drive encrypted. Well, if you look right down there in the left corner, that's a PS2 connector with a radio in it. If I put that in between your keyboard and the system, I can listen to everything you're typing, including the passphrase for your encryption. So if I can get to your system, I can install one of these connectors, and I know you don't look at your PS2 port every time you log on. So I can find out what the encryption password for your hard drive is, and your encryption is worthless. If you've got a firewall or an intrusion detection system on the edge of your network and it's looking for packets, you might say, okay, well, I'm proof against viruses because I'll see them communicating with their host over in Russia or China. Except if they can physically get to your system, they can install a radio modem, and there's a picture of a radio modem that communicates TCP/IP over the CB radio band. Are you listening to the CB radio band for virus traffic? Would you know if your system was being hacked that way? So you have to think outside the box a little bit when it comes to physical security. As far as access control goes, okay, you've got a door with a lock on it, you've got electronic badging. Do you have offset ceilings? I know that in one particular case, a supervisor of mine locked his keys in his office, and he was amazed to discover that I could stand on a chair and drop a loop of string through the raised ceiling down behind the door, lift the door handle, and open his door and get in. Do you have raised floors? Do the raised floors extend beyond the area where the locked door is? Can someone crawl under them to get to your systems? You also have to remember that physical access controls only work if the employees cooperate with them. I worked at one federal data center briefly where it took so long to get your electronic badge programmed to get into an area that most contractors' assignments were shorter than the time it took to get their badge properly programmed. So they developed the habit of just letting each other through the doors without worrying about who had access to what area, and the system was useless. In most buildings, if I put on a dirty coverall and I take one of those wheeled trash cans and walk up to the door and knock on it, people will let me in because they assume I'm the janitor. And I've tried that. It works. One of the things that you really need to do is build a bond of trust with your employees, because ultimately the employees who are running the system are your best security. If somebody strange is walking around the network operations center up here, I know those guys. They'll ask them who they are and what they're doing there. That kind of security is irreplaceable. Okay, logical security is basically keeping people from logging on illegitimately or hacking into your system. A lot of the controls that keep a Linux system secure are bundled into a utility called SE Linux, or Security Enhanced Linux. It used to be that you had to install this separately and then figure out how to turn it on. It now is pretty much default in most Linux installations. Fedora includes SE Linux by default, and it's turned on by default. In addition, there's a number of subjects that fall under logical security. Strong passwords with timely expiration. So you want passwords that aren't easily guessed. Somebody did a survey around NOAA and found that something like 60% of the passwords were dictionary words that were fairly easily guessed in a brute force attack. That's bad. You also need passwords to expire so that people don't have a long time to work at hacking them. And then there's two-factor authentication. Anytime we access a high-impact system that has important data on it, or when we come in remotely, we're supposed to be using two-factor authentication. Most people historically in NOAA have done two-factor authentication with RSA tokens. Those are those little things that get a satellite signal and give you a one-time password that's good for a minute. We are supposed to be implementing HSPD 12, and I can tell you that the security office in the OCIO has actually built the infrastructure now for HSPD 12. So if you have one of these badges, the new kind, you can use those for two-factor authentication. There is software called Active Identity, and you install that on a PC along with a little $15 USB card reader, and then people can use that for two-factor authentication. So you need your card plugged into the card reader, and you need your username and password to get into a system. That's two-factor authentication. Another important piece of securing Linux is sudo. Instead of allowing people to run as root, which is what we used to do in scripts that did maintenance functions, there's now a process that allows you to give them root permission for running one command, or 2 or 3 commands. And that is highly recommended, that rather than giving anyone a root password, you include them in the sudoers file, and I'll talk about that in a minute. You should also have internal firewalls, regardless of what firewalls you have on your network. Who knows who's going to get into your building with a laptop and plug into a port. So it's good to have an internal firewall on your own machine as well, just to back up whatever security the network at large has. And then of course you want to remove any unnecessary packages and turn off any unnecessary services. If you don't install Perl on your machine, then nobody can hack you by injecting a Perl script into it. And then the last part of logical security is your log files. Logs are very important. You can mine through them to look for patterns of behavior that indicate someone trying to hack. And in addition, legally, you can't prosecute someone for hacking a system unless you can show that you collected enough data to prove that they were doing something illicit, and log files are often necessary for prosecuting someone who's been hacking a system, so they're very important. You might want occasionally to migrate log files off of your server so that hackers can't get in and delete records of their access. Okay, for passwords and user authentication, Linux uses pluggable authentication modules, or PAM. This is a very flexible mechanism. You can plug and play different types of authentication on a Linux system. The default for Unix and Linux systems is to look up passwords in /etc/password. Most Linux and most Unixes have moved the actual passwords to a secondary file called etc shadow. The reason being, anyone can read etc password. You have to, because you have to authenticate against it. If you store the encrypted passwords in there, people can get the encrypted version of other people's passwords, and they can spend days crunching them until they get a usable password out of it. If you move those passwords into etc shadow, the etc shadow file is only readable by root, so it keeps hackers who might have gotten a low-level password from getting access to other passwords on the system. And this is pretty much done by default now in most Linuxes. But you don't have to authenticate against your local password files at all. You can set Linux up at installation time to authenticate against a directory. It will use an LDAP directory like the LDAP directory that Noah has currently, or you can use an active directory. You can also now get some pretty good implementations. You can't read it on this screen, but it's in the notes in the slides. There's some links there to people who have set up Linux with a version of PAM that authenticates using the HSPD12 credentials. So you could set a Linux system up to use two-factor authentication. One of the things that you want to set up is password aging. And there's several parameters. They're stored in etc login.defs and etc default user add. And basically, you can set up how long a password stays valid and what to do if a password expires. You can also set up password complexity. You can set up the number of letters, the number of numbers, how long the minimum password length is. Those are in etc pam.d system off. There's an example of the parameters there. And then there's sudo. Again, sudo is used so that you don't have to give people root permission on your system. And there's a sudoers file that lists who's allowed to access what commands. So you can go into etc sudoers and you can grant privileges to users to use commands without a password, or you can require a password. You also get a log in vorlog secure of the people who have used sudo to access commands. This is some documentation on the format of etc sudoers. So you've got some examples there. Reynolds all equals all. User Reynolds can execute any command as any user but must know the password. Reynolds all equals root shutdown. User Reynolds can execute only command shutdown but must know the password. So you can use etc sudoers to set up particular users and give them access to either all commands or particular commands, and they can either be required to know the password or can be exempted from having to know the password to execute the command. So this way, if you have particular commands, let's say that you want to tar your user partition out to tape and then reboot your system every Sunday morning, you put that in a cron job, which is running a batch file. That batch file would not have to have root access in order to do things like retar that partition and reboot the system. You can put a user into etc sudoers to give them permission to run those commands, then use that user to submit the cron job, and then it can run without having to have the root permissions. So that protects your system from getting hacked by somebody who gets access to that. Okay, we went through, sorry, I'm a little hoarse today. We went through IP tables in the network session last week, but IP tables can be used to either block or allow specific ports within your network. It can also screen for particular IP addresses. It can either block a range of IP addresses, or it can allow traffic from a certain range of IP addresses. This is a good thing to set up. Probably the best way to do it is through the GUI, but what this allows you to do is have a firewall within your server that backs up the overall network firewall. So let's say that this is an internal web server that's only good for NOAA internal employees. You can make an IP tables entry to block everything but the range of IP addresses that are used internally by your users. And again, we saw last week in the network class that there's a GUI for that. Is that me?
No.
Sorry? This is the GUI. You can see here there are different ports on your system that are associated with different services. Typically HTTP, your web server is on port 80. Ports are just an abstraction. They're a way of taking your network connection and using it for multiple purposes. But you can set up specific ports to either be blocked or allowed, and then you can also set up particular address ranges to be blocked or allowed. So this is an important thing to do if you're connected to a network. And then there's package management. Linux by default comes with a very large set of functionality. You have Perl, you have PHP, you have Java. There's a lot of different packages available which give you some very powerful tools to use, but it's just common sense that you wouldn't install tools that you're not going to use. If you're running a web server and you're not doing Perl scripting as part of that web server, don't install Perl. That way people can't hack you with a Perl script. It's kind of common sense. You can get rid of packages that may have been inadvertently installed either with RPM. The RPM-E command will eliminate packages from your system. And if you're using yum, you can say yum erase and a package name. Yum is easier to deal with because it will find out what the interdependencies are and help you resolve them. RPM, you're kind of on your own for that. And then there's a GUI called Package Kit. It's available for Fedora after Fedora 9. And this just lets you graphically do what you were doing on the text line with yum. You can take particular packages and either install them or erase them from your system. And then there's deactivating services. Many of the services on a Linux box attach themselves to network ports and allow you to provide services to the community at large. An LDAP server or a web server. You probably don't want services running on your system if that's not the primary purpose of your box. So you can turn off services that are unneeded. On the older versions of Fedora, you would use checkconfig. Checkconfig ---- list will tell you what's running at each run level. And then you can do checkconfig ---- level, list the run levels, then the service name, and then off, and that will turn that service off at those run levels. And I should say that Fedora is moving to a new paradigm for controlling services. They're moving away from the old System 5 concept of run levels, and they're moving to a system where you group services in named groups. So instead of saying init3 to go to run level 3, you would say services and then the name of a package of services, and it would turn those services on. I will update the course to the more recent version of Fedora for the next presentation. But up to Fedora 14, they are still using check config. There is also a GUI, of course, called System Config Services. So you can go into your system menu and go into administration. You can turn services on and off using the GUI. And then there's system logging. It's important to keep good log files, both for mining them for evidence of hacking and just to have a record of what's going on your system. The standard system log for Linux is var log messages, and then many of your important services, like sudo, have their own log files. And in the init program which starts those services up, if you look in etc rc.d init.d, there are scripts which start and stop these services, and in those scripts you'll see the parameters that those services are being started and stopped with. Sometimes the log files are specified on a command line, sometimes they are in a config file for that particular service. But if you rely on a service heavily, it's probably a good idea to take a look at adjusting its logging so that you get all the useful information that you need. It is, however, a good idea to mount the /var directory in a separate partition on your disk, because should you ever make a mistake and turn on logging too heavily, or one of your programs gets stuck in a loop, you can fill your hard drive with log files, which is a bad thing. But if you mount the /var directory on a separate partition, you can only fill that partition and you won't crash your system. Also remember that hackers often go in and try to edit log files to erase evidence of their hacking. You can do a couple of things. You can move the log files, go into the config file for that service, move the real log file to a different directory that's hard to guess, and then put a fake log file in the default directory. It's sometimes called a honey trap. It's also a good idea to rotate logs and drag them off the system to a safe place fairly frequently. You can even do things like set your log file to go to a disk that's mounted via NFS on an entirely separate system. You can have a log file server that's backed up frequently and log your files to that server. Now there are utilities that you can use to exploit your log files and get useful information out of them. One of them is a utility that our security group in the OCIO just got an enterprise license for. It's called ArcSight. There's a master ArcSight server in West Virginia at the Security Operations Center, the new Security Operations Center out there. You can get a client ArcSight server for your site that will sit in your network and collect log files from your systems, including Windows systems, including HP, including Solaris, and it'll analyze them, and it'll do a couple of things. It'll send you alerts. You can tell it to send emails to key system operators if there are suspicious events going on, and you can also look for error conditions and things that may not be hacking but might be hazardous to the health of your system. You can contact the NOAA Security Office if you're interested in getting in on that utility. There's also utilities like Nagios, and Nagios will monitor system health, and again, you can alert your operators either by email or by text message. So there are tools that work with your logging and enhance the information that's available to you. And then the last category of security is personnel security. Some of this is contained in the NIST 853 controls. Some of those controls deal with personnel issues. You have background check requirements. You want to make sure that users are granted the least amount of privilege that they need to perform their jobs. So don't give everybody root access. And then you want separation of duties. You don't want the person who is responsible for the system that writes payroll checks to also be your security officer who's monitoring the log files. That would be a no-no. But without buy-in, none of it is going to work very well. Given enough motivation, people can get around most controls. There are ways, as I showed you earlier, there's ways of sneaking around a lot of these controls. There's a phrase, it's impossible to make anything foolproof because fools are so ingenious. Sometimes people break systems even when they're not intending to. One example is at the university that I went to, they had a 4-hour battery backup on their corporate mainframe that did all the important financial processing. And they lost power in a snowstorm, and the system went down after 30 minutes. And when they did a post-mortem investigation, they found out the computer operator had been cold because the lights and the heat were out, so he plugged his coffee pot into the battery backup for the computer and drained the battery, keeping his coffee hot. So you have to make sure that people are aware and engaged for any of these controls to work properly. The most secure environments are ones where the employees actually care about the security of the system, where they're watching, where they question people who don't belong in the computer lab, where they look to see who's logged on to the system and what they're doing occasionally. And of course, you can always train people. There is some free training available in security through the DOC's Computer Learning Center, and many security utilities like ArcSight come with training modules, and it's a good idea to keep people up to speed on the controls that are supposed to be guarding the systems. And then something that's related to security, but is also a good idea just in and of itself, is system backups. Most of you have probably backed up a system at some time or other. Either you plugged in a USB drive and copied your important folders onto it, or you made a DVD of something that you wanted to make sure you didn't lose if your hard drive crashed. It is both part of the NIST set of controls and just a general good idea in general to have a good backup strategy for your system. The systems can be backed up to a variety of media. There was a time when backup meant tape. You just mounted a tape, you tarred everything on your system onto the tape, and that was your backup. Backups are getting to be more sophisticated. Things like Oracle now have their own internal backup utility, so instead of backing up the whole hard drive, you use the Oracle backup facility to back up particular tables in your database. You also don't have to go to tape for everything. DVDs are fairly dense. You can also now back up directly to disk, and in fact, with our Web Operations Center here at NOAA, one of the strategies that they employ is, rather than creating boxes and boxes of tape, they have 3 mirrors of their content at 3 geographically distributed sites. And so their off-site backup is a live copy of their data that they can fall back to like that if there's an outage at one of their sites. They just load balance between the multiple sites, and if one goes off the air, the others pick up the load, and that's their off-site backup. You can also get backup systems that have removable cheap disks. They use the serial or parallel ATA disks that are very cheap. And on a cost per gigabyte basis, they're comparable to tape. They have hot swap interfaces, so you can back up to a hard drive and then take the hard drive someplace and store it off-site in a closet. You can also have disk arrays that are mirrored to a remote location. So for instance, we have a facility at the ITC called REL Data, and it's a 75 terabyte array, and it is mirrored over to Germantown. There's a second copy of that array, and when we write to files on that storage array in our facility, there's hardware in that disk array that in the background copies those blocks over to the other array in Germantown. That way, if our system goes down, we have backup servers in Germantown that come up and start providing the service using a live copy of the data. Those systems often will combine just a straight mirror with something called disk deduplication, so that they look for duplicated data, record it once, and then just have a pointer to that copy of the data. It reduces the amount of storage. It also reduces the amount that you have to back up to an off-site site. And again, the one utility that's always available to you for backups is TAR, or Tape Archive. You've probably all used this a million times if you've been around Linux or Unix for very long. TAR is very straightforward, and although it was meant to be used with a tape drive, you can also TAR from a disk partition to another file and then copy that file somewhere. You can combine TAR with OpenSSL using pipes. And there's an example here of creating a TAR file of a source directory, piping it through OpenSSL using DES3 encryption, and then a secret key, and then piping that to DD or disk dump, and then sending that to an output file. So what we're doing is creating an encrypted TAR file of that source directory in that output file. We can then run that output file back through the reverse of that string of commands, and we can restore the directory. So it is possible to do both compression and encryption using TAR, although that's going to use your CPU resources. If you have a tape library that has an internal hardware accelerator, it's probably more efficient to use that. There's commercial backup software available. Probably the most widely used in NOAA is the EMC Legato Networker. It's used by the email system, or the former email system before we went to Gmail. We use it out at the ITC. It has a GUI interface. You can set up groups of systems and directories, and you can run, if you have a tape library that has multiple tape drives in it, you can be running multiple parallel backup streams to the tape library. It's very efficient. There's also open source backup software beyond TAR. One of those is Amanda, which is the Advanced Maryland Automatic Network Disk Archive. This was written at the University of Maryland Computer Science Department and then given away as open source. It's now managed as a project on SourceForge.net, and it has a fairly extensive library of backup utilities. Then there's a program called Bacula, and it is somewhat similar to the EMC Networker program. It has a GUI. It allows you to assign groups of systems and monitor backups through the GUI. It's probably a little more user-friendly than Amanda. So if you can't afford the commercial software, you can come close to its functionality using free open source alternatives. And of course, since we're talking about security, we should talk about antivirus. Sooner or later, somebody in your group is going to click on the wrong web link, and a virus is going to try to download itself to your system. There's a couple of packages. One is commercial and the other is open source. McAfee, which is our corporate standard for antivirus. McAfee actually has a version for Linux. It will do things like on-access scanning, so that when you try to open a file, it scans it for viruses before it lets you execute it. Nifty things like that. It'll scan your emails as you read them, and you do have to pay for it, unfortunately. McAfee is not free, but it is a very good package. And then there's something called the CLAM antivirus. CLAM is available for most platforms. It's also available for Windows. CLAM is a fairly good antivirus program, but because it's open source, its virus pattern files are not always as complete or as up to date as the McAfee. So you're a little bit more at risk using the free open source software. However, if you're running on Linux, not that many people bother writing viruses for Linux, so it kind of balances out. You can also use Linux for security appliances. You can use Linux to guard your network and protect other applications. Unix through IP tables can be, for instance, a firewall. It can be an intrusion detection system. There's a utility called Snort, which is open source and probably the most famous of the Unix/Linux security utilities. It is an intrusion detection system. It was released in 1998 by SourceFire. It's free, it's open source, it'll do real-time traffic and analysis, it'll do packet logging on IP networks, and of course the really nifty thing is they sell tchotchkes. They sell mugs and hats and t-shirts. So if you use Snort, you can let everyone know that you're a Snort guru. And last but not least, if you do have a security incident, don't try to fix it yourself. NOAA has a group called the NCERT, and they are the ones you should report it to. And in fact, they don't want you to fix your own problems because that will interfere with their forensics on the system. If somebody gets a virus on their system, don't go try to eliminate yourself. Call the NCERT, file an incident report, let them investigate. They have a website. There's a link on here. It's https www.csp.noaa.gov v3 form index.php. That's an automated form for filing incident reports with the NCERT. There's also phone numbers there. Unfortunately, the font for the people's names doesn't show up on the projector, but it's in your slides. So if you have a security incident, if you even strongly suspect there's a security incident going on, enlist the NCERT's help. That's what they're there for, and they are the ones who should be investigating and fixing these things. Okay, I can tell by your smiling faces you were all enthralled. Are there any questions? Oh, I did that good of a job, huh? Okay, I do appreciate you coming. Next week we're going to start half an hour late because the FAA is going to be in here doing some sort of party, and they asked if we could start a little late to give them some extra room. So if you show up for class and there's some strangers in here doing weird things, it's the FAA, and they'll be done at 11:30, and we'll start the class half an hour late. Thanks, everyone. Oh, sorry, what?
To answer your question, it does appear there is a NOAA theme song.
Oh my gosh.
It'll be sitting in your email. I didn't listen to it, but it's on YouTube.
Oh my gosh. Well, hey, maybe on the final class we can lead everybody in a rousing chorus of the Noah theme song.
I hope not. Nobody needs to hear me.
Okay.
Have a good one.
You too.